This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 377 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I think we've gotten to the point where the majority of fantasy managers, at least the hardcore ones, are drafting quarterbacks late. Your casual work league may still see Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson go in the middle of the first round, but any serious league will see quarterbacks fall in drafts. Things have changed quite a bit since I first launched and wrote the Late Round Quarterback ebook 8 years ago. Back then, we had 5 quarterbacks drafted in the first 2 rounds of drafts. That does not happen anymore. What's usually misunderstood about the late round quarterback draft strategy, though, is that it's not just about a game of chicken. I can't tell you how many times people have hit my mentions and said something along the lines of, look, my QB1 was the 25th quarterback taken in this draft. Late round QB would be proud. Guys, I'm not proud of you if Nick Foles is your QB1. I'm questioning if you really are understanding what the late round quarterback strategy is all about. And what it's all about is extracting value. But with things changing across the fantasy football landscape, we should change too. When we're drafting our fantasy football teams, in order to really extract that value I was just talking about, we have to properly play the market. We have to adjust to what other teams in our league are doing. Every player is a value somewhere. I can say to draft your quarterback late, but if everyone in your league abides by that same strategy, then you should pounce on the top quarterbacks at some point in your draft. This got me thinking about a few questions that a lot of people may be asking themselves this year. Should we be changing our approach with the quarterback position in fantasy drafts with everyone waiting on the position now? Is Lamar Jackson specifically someone that we should be targeting early? And if so, when should we be looking to draft an elite quarterback? I'm going to try to answer those questions today. But before getting into them, I wanted to let you guys know about a really fun thing going on over on FanDuel called the Football Multiverse. Each week, my colleague Jim Sonis and I were streaming a Madden game simulation live on FanDuel's YouTube channel. And each game has a crazy what-if scenario. In week 1, it was, what if the Bears had drafted Patrick Mahomes, where we put Mahomes on Chicago and Mitch Trubisky on the Chiefs. And it didn't go well for the Chiefs. This week, we've got, what if Drew Brees had retired, where we're going to watch Taysom Hill quarterback the Saints against the Falcons. You can test your prediction skills and play a free DFS tournament for $3,000 in real prizes by making a lineup with players in that Madden simulation. Head to FanDuel.com/NFL Multiverse to enter, and don't forget to subscribe and tune into FanDuel's YouTube channel on Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern to watch. Should be a lot of fun. Okay, so last week on Number Fire, I wrote an article that was called, Did Lamar Jackson Break the Late Round Quarterback Draft Strategy? Clearly, he was the best late round quarterback value in the history of fantasy football last year. But because of his production and because of how he produced his fantasy numbers, I was curious about whether Jackson was worthy of an early round quarterback selection this year. In order to do that, I had to talk about the late round quarterback philosophy a bit. We can't understand if Jackson is a worthy early round selection without understanding the overall strategy. So let's start there. Some of this may sound redundant if you've been with this podcast for a while, but I still think that it's worthwhile to walk through. There are 4 main concepts that drive the late round quarterback strategy. The first one is supply and demand. I've talked to you guys about this enough, but in your single quarterback league, each team only needs 1 quarterback. This naturally brings down the cost to acquire quarterbacks in your fantasy drafts. If teams need fewer of them, then they won't spend up to get them. That's why we find usable passers in the double-digit rounds every single year. The second idea is predictability. And this can be looked at on a season-long level and a weekly level. On the season-long level, we look at predictability in terms of how a player was ranked or looked at in the preseason versus how that season ended for that player. So preseason ranking versus postseason result. One of the things that early round quarterback drafters have liked to say over the last decade is that getting one of those quarterbacks early is safe. That quarterbacks drafted early don't bust at the same rate as other positions. But that's not really true. If you look at top 12 quarterbacks versus top 24 running backs and top 24 wide receivers, and we're looking at 12 versus 24 here because you start at least twice as many backs and wideouts in your fantasy league. But if you look at the R-squared values between preseason ADP and then postseason result, there's actually a stronger correlation at running back and wide receiver. And I did that across the last 9 fantasy football seasons. What that means is that average draft position explains top 24 running back and wide receiver season-long fantasy point totals better than it does top 12 quarterbacks. So elite quarterbacks and quarterbacks in general are actually not more predictable from a season-long perspective. They are more predictable week to week, though. If you build out projections each week, you'll have an easier time projecting quarterback than the other positions because they control so much of the game. There's just a larger sample to work with. Now, I have math behind that, but I'm not going to bore you with that math on today's show. Hit me up on Twitter and I can link to an article on the coefficient of variation and what it says about weekly predictability if you really want. But because quarterbacks are predictable each week, it means you'll have an easier time streaming the position. You can find usable guys on the waiver wire, as we know because of supply and demand, but those usable players are also usable because they're predictable. All of that just devalues the quarterback position even more. So quarterbacks are cheap because of supply and demand. They're not predictable on a yearly basis, but they are on a weekly one. All of those things devalue the position. The third thing to make note of is scoring variance. At a really basic and high level, the top quarterback each year over the last decade or so has outscored the 12th best quarterback by 123 total points. That's per season. The top wide receiver to the 24th wide receiver is 147 points. And at running back, it's 218. There are other ways to look at this, including changing the baseline players to look more accurate and to be more accurate. Or you can look at the drop in usable weeks by the different positions to show how much better top running backs and wide receivers are against their position versus quarterbacks. But the general idea here is that top quarterbacks have typically not outscored the rest of their position at the same rate as wide receivers and running backs. But here's the thing, guys. Historically, quarterbacks may not be giving you this huge edge in fantasy football. But what if Lamar Jackson is different? Like, Jackson did give you a pretty big edge last year. He was a difference maker. And that's despite the fact that he played a replaceable position. This leads me to a section that I wrote about in the article surrounding regression. Lamar Jackson may be able to do what he did with his legs last year over year. It'd be a crazy feat, but let's just assume that it's possible. That gives him a really high floor each and every week and season. So we know he's likely going to finish, let's say, as like the QB6 each year. That helps out on the predictability front for sure. What I know though, and this is almost with 100% certainty, I know he's going to regress through the air. Last season, Jackson threw 36 touchdown passes. Not only was that just the 32nd time that touchdown total had been hit in NFL history, but he did it on 401 attempts. That's a 9% touchdown rate. And touchdown rate, for those of you who don't know, is just touchdowns divided by attempts. He threw a touchdown on 9% of his attempts. In NFL history, that's the second highest mark among 300-plus attempt passers. Of the 12 quarterbacks who have next season data while also hitting an 8% touchdown rate in year N, so that's a full percentage point lower than what Lamar Jackson had last year, none of them improved on their touchdown rate year over year. Each touchdown rate got worse. And the dip in rate, the decrease in rate on average, was 3%. Just imagine Lamar Jackson with a 6% touchdown rate instead of a 9% one. That would mean that he would have thrown 12 fewer touchdowns than he threw last year. Now, clearly, if Jackson threw 12 fewer touchdowns, the Ravens wouldn't have scored 12 fewer times. They could have just ran more. And Lamar Jackson might have had more rushing scores as a result. But then there's a regression-related problem to that as well. Baltimore had 58 touchdowns last year. Of the 11 teams that have hit 55 touchdowns since 2011, only one of those teams increased their touchdown total the following year. And the average drop in touchdowns from one year to the next was 14. Now, part of that big drop was because there were teams who legitimately broke records. It was very, very hard for those teams to repeat that feat. But even if you look at the teams who scored 50 to 54 touchdowns, so teams who scored fewer than Baltimore last year, we've seen them drop by 11.5 touchdowns year over year on average. So just to put this all another way, Baltimore is unlikely going to score 58 touchdowns again in 2020. That plays into the idea that Lamar Jackson's touchdown rate is going to regress. But we can't assume that a regression through the air would mean an improvement on the ground. It basically means that it's very, very possible that we just saw the best of Lamar Jackson statistically. So in turn, I highly doubt Lamar Jackson gives fantasy managers the edge that he was providing last season. I do think he'll give you an edge, just not to the degree that we saw in 2019. Okay, that's the stuff that I needed to talk through before getting to what I think is the most important and interesting part of the late round quarterback strategy. And it's the fourth and final concept, which is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the loss of potential gain from other alternatives when one alternative is chosen. So if you get Lamar Jackson at 25th overall, which is where he's currently being ranked over on Fantasy Pros, the opportunity cost in getting Jackson there is Juju Smith-Schuster, DJ Moore, or Leonard Fournette, who are all players being ranked at or behind him. For purposes of this podcast and for the article that I wrote over on NumberFire, I wanted to make opportunity cost really consumable for people. I wanted to think of it more philosophically because I think it's a concept that's just so overlooked in the fantasy football space. People far too often get fixated on the player that they're drafting when they should really be concerned about the players that they're not drafting instead. It's easy to say, I want Lamar Jackson. But what are you not getting when you get Lamar Jackson? One way to look at opportunity cost differently is to think of things in a more binary way. Our goal in fantasy football in the end is to draft league-winning players. We want the guys who are giving us a huge advantage week in and week out. So where are those league winners coming from? Because if the league-winning running backs are typically drafted in like round 6, then why would it matter if you took Lamar Jackson in the second round? You can just get one of those running backs in round 6. To figure this out, I first wanted to define what a league-winning player looked like. What I did was I charted all the RB1s, RB2s, RB3s, and so on up to RB25. And I marked down their average points scored over the last 9 years. So RB1s, players who finished as the RB1, they've averaged 381 PPR points over the last 9 seasons. RB2s have averaged 329 points. I did the exact same exercise at wide receiver. I then wanted to find where league winners typically finish. What I noticed was that after the RB8 spot, things started to flatten out a bit, meaning your RB8 has traditionally given you X amount of points. Your RB9 has given you a pretty big dip in points scored from X. But the RB10, the drop off from the RB9 to the RB10, is not super significant. And it continues to be not super significant as you move down rankings. Essentially, all I found was where your big advantage at both running back and wide receiver stops. That's why I was saying earlier this is a binary way of looking at whether or not a player is a league winner. That happened at the number 8 spot for running backs and the 9 spot for wide receivers. So all top 8 running backs since 2011 were league winners, and all top 9 wide receivers were league winners. Again, I'm doing things this way because it's an easier way to think about opportunity cost. If you're in a draft and you think of this in terms of, I likely can get a league winner here, or I likely can't get a league winner here, then it makes your decision to take a quarterback a little bit easier. If your probability of getting a league winner is small, then you can get your quarterback. So the question now is, where have top 8 running backs typically been drafted? And the same question applies for top 9 wide receivers. What I found was what we'd sort of expect. A very solid 63% of top 8 running backs over the last 9 years were drafted in the top 30. Just 11% of them were drafted between picks 31 and 50, and 26% of them were drafted after pick 50. That 26% number may seem high, but keep in mind that a lot of running backs get drafted late. And this includes free agents too, or guys who weren't drafted. Your hit rate sucks after the first few rounds of drafts, even if there's a decent percentage of running backs that produce. The numbers are pretty similar at wide receiver too. 59% of top 9 wide receivers are drafted in the top 30, and then between picks 31 and 50, you see just 11% of them get drafted. So what this data is telling you is that league-winning players, or how I'm defining league-winning players, but league-winning players are generally drafted in the top 30. A lot of them are. There's a substantially higher hit rate at running back and wide receiver during the first 2.5 rounds of drafts. What that means is that if you're taking Lamar Jackson or any other quarterback that early, even if you believe that they're giving you a strong point edge, you have to recognize that your opportunity cost is incredibly high. It doesn't start to drop until the end of the 3rd round and into the 4th round. Now, another point to make with all of this, which makes it risky to get Lamar Jackson, is that if you're the first person to draft a quarterback, you run the risk of really devaluing that pick. When you're drafting, you want to be the person that starts a draft run, not the person who finishes it. If you get Lamar Jackson first and the next quarterback doesn't go off the board for 6 more rounds, then you could have been able to wait a lot longer to get Lamar Jackson. Patrick Mahomes 6 rounds after Lamar Jackson is a way, way better value. And if you're in a draft room with savvy late round quarterback drafters, then you run that risk. You run the risk of devaluing Lamar Jackson. This is part of the reason why I'd probably rather actually draft Patrick Mahomes in most cases this year than Lamar Jackson. Because Mahomes is likely going to go after Jackson. So you don't have to be the one to make that first move. And my projections actually have Mahomes scoring just 6 fewer fantasy points than Lamar Jackson. And that's really my take specifically on early round quarterbacks. If you're going to get one this year, I think Mahomes is the better value, especially if you're not sure when teams are going to pounce and get quarterbacks in your draft. And that sweet spot to get an elite quarterback is likely in the middle of the 4th round, just given opportunity cost. Yes, the data says more in the middle of the 3rd round to the late 3rd round, but going in the middle of the 4th, you're giving yourself a little bit of a buffer to ensure you're making an optimal decision. But let's be honest, I'm likely not going to be drafting those 2 players in anything outside of an expert or an analyst draft, where literally everyone drafts quarterbacks late. I actually got Lamar Jackson in the 4th round in a draft that I did with industry people earlier this month. If you follow the middle of the 4th round rule, you're probably not going to get Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes this year. And you're probably going to continue following a late round quarterback strategy. And I'd agree. In probably 80 to 90% of leagues out there, drafting your quarterback late is the route to go yet again this season. At the very least, it's a pretty safe way of drafting given the depth at the position. But in leagues where the managers are a little bit sharper, in leagues where a lot of them wait to get a quarterback, I think there's an argument now that getting more of that second tier, a middle round quarterback, makes a lot of sense. Historically, drafting a middle round quarterback has been a waste of time. The average points scored among quarterbacks ranked 5 through 10 in average draft position has actually been lower than the average points scored by the QB 12 through the QB 15 over the last 9 years. Think about what that means. Your late round quarterbacks, on average, have actually outproduced middle round quarterbacks over the last decade. But the market is getting smarter. Years ago, given what Ryan Tannehill accomplished last year, we would have seen Tannehill be a top 5 quarterback in ADP this season. But instead, he's a mid-range QB2 because people are understanding regression more. They understand how Tannehill accumulated points and then it wasn't totally sustainable. The market is also understanding the importance of rushing at the quarterback position. Years and years ago on NumberFire, Sharp Football Analysis' Rich Rebar wrote an article and claimed that rushing quarterbacks were the Konami code of fantasy football. He wrote that article over a half decade ago, and people are just now really truly seeing that impact. Traditionally, we'd see a random great rushing season or maybe a set of seasons if you're Cam Newton, but we wouldn't ever see the passing numbers to match the rushing ones at the quarterback position. Rushing numbers really strengthen a quarterback's fantasy total. But for that player to go over the top and be a Lamar Jackson type like we saw last year, he needs the passing element to his game too. And like I said, traditionally it hasn't been there until now. The NFL has changed. We've not only got Lamar Jackson giving us insane rushing numbers, but Jackson gave us those insane passing numbers last year too. And we've got a handful of quarterbacks who have that type of ceiling. Maybe not a Lamar Jackson 2019 ceiling, but a QB1 or a QB2 ceiling. And that's really all you're looking for with a fantasy football quarterback to give you a significant advantage at the position. But think of the quarterback landscape and think of the players who have that dual rushing and passing upside. Lamar Jackson obviously comes to mind. Patrick Mahomes and his underrated rushing ability also comes to mind. Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson, maybe Josh Allen. Those are the guys who have that true difference-making upside in fantasy football. The problem is that they're all being ranked that way. For the first time in my years of doing fantasy football analysis, the market seems super efficient at the quarterback position. Of course, I have my favorite late round quarterback choices. Ryan Tannehill is someone who has that rushing upside to go along with the passing upside. He's someone that you can target late. But he's not as safe and interesting as someone like Kyler Murray. He doesn't have the same type of profile as Russell Wilson or Deshaun Watson. This is where the late round quarterback strategy has gotten really, really interesting. Instead of us entering our draft rooms knowing that we'd be getting someone late, knowing that we could just draft loads and loads of running backs and wide receivers early to build depth and increase our chances of hitting on those players, we may have to start thinking differently. And why not think differently? Why not, in leagues where a lot of fantasy managers are waiting on their quarterback, why not take one in the middle rounds? Because let me reveal something that a lot of you may not know. When I wrote the late round quarterback ebook back in 2011 and 2012, I didn't write the book saying to draft a quarterback in round 12 or round 13 or even round 11. Late at that time was round 8. It was where opportunity cost clearly was not significant. The difference between a round 8 pick and a round 11 pick is not that significant, you guys. Taking on an opportunity cost in the 8th round is not a whole lot different than doing the same in the 11th. And you know what's interesting? Back in 2011, the QB 12, or the last hypothetical starter in your 12-team league, he was being drafted at pick 80. That's the middle of the 7th round. Last season, in 2019, Jameis Winston was the QB 12 according to My Fantasy League's ADP. He was falling off draft boards at pick 108. Pick 80, where the QB 12 was drafted back in 2011, pick 80 was where we saw the QB 6 last year. If opportunity cost wasn't significant in round 7 or round 8 in 2012 when I published the late round quarterback, then why would it be significant in round 7 or round 8 today? Sure, the quarterback position is deeper. I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing the opposite end. Taking on a middle round quarterback hasn't been profitable in the past, but it also hasn't been all that costly. It just hasn't mattered. But if we're cognizant of the fact that the market is getting a little bit sharper, and that the market is now paying more attention to mobile quarterbacks with passing upside, then we may want to think about our own philosophy shifting. I'm not ready to change my Twitter handle to middle round QB. Please don't take this the wrong way. Drafting quarterbacks late is still a very good approach, especially in particular formats. I'm merely saying that in the 20% of leagues where everyone's sharp and everyone's ready to go with a late round quarterback, you can and should adjust. A late round quarterback a decade ago is a middle round quarterback today. The opportunity cost in getting Kyler Murray or Dak Prescott in some leagues is not very high. And you should pounce on that opportunity. Because this is not a game of chicken. This is a game of value. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Late Round QB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.